What if one sentence could destroy a reputation, and one moment could change an entire company forever? On an ordinary Monday morning inside the headquarters of a billion-dollar corporation, a white executive looked at a well-dressed black man and calmly told him, "You don't belong here." Everyone in the room believed she was simply doing her job. But within minutes, the chairman walked in, headed straight toward that same man, and what happened next left every executive frozen in silence. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's a story about power, respect, and the unforgettable moment when the person everyone underestimated became the one no one could ignore. Stay with me, because the ending is far more shocking than anyone expected. The fastest way to discover someone's character is to give them the chance to underestimate another person. The words floated through the executive conference suite long before anyone realized how true they would become. Morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Hawthorne Global Headquarters in Manhattan, washing the polished walnut table in warm gold while the skyline stretched across the glass behind it. Every chair around the table was already occupied by senior executives dressed in tailored suits, reviewing financial reports that would determine the future of a company worth billions of dollars. The atmosphere carried the quiet confidence that only comes from people accustomed to making decisions capable of changing thousands of careers with a single vote. At precisely 9 o'clock, Victoria Bennett entered the room wearing an elegant cream business suit, her brown blonde hair gathered neatly into a sophisticated bun. As executive vice president, she had spent more than a decade climbing through relentless competition, earning a reputation for flawless preparation and uncompromising standards. She believed every detail mattered. Every presentation, every schedule, every appearance reflected discipline. She glanced once around the room, satisfied that everything looked exactly as planned, until the conference room door opened again. A man stepped inside carrying a slim leather portfolio. He appeared to be around 40 years old, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and dark tie. His thick black hair was neatly combed to one side, and his calm expression suggested complete confidence without the slightest hint of arrogance. Instead of introducing himself immediately, he quietly looked around the room as though confirming he had arrived at the correct meeting before walking toward the final empty chair at the far end of the table. Several executives briefly looked up before returning to their laptops. Victoria studied him carefully. She had reviewed every confirmed attendee the previous evening, and his face was unfamiliar. Assuming he had entered the wrong meeting, she stood before he reached the chair. "Excuse me," she said with polite professionalism that carried unmistakable authority. "This meeting is reserved for senior leadership." The man stopped and smiled politely. "I understand." His voice remained calm and measured. "I am expected here." Victoria folded her hands confidently. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The support team meeting is taking place on the floor below us. Someone will gladly show you where it is." A few executives exchanged curious glances. The man neither argued nor appeared offended. Instead, he thanked her with a respectful nod. "I appreciate your concern." He gently placed his leather portfolio on the empty chair, but made no effort to sit down. Victoria interpreted his composure as hesitation. "If you would like, I can have an assistant escort you downstairs." The room grew noticeably quieter. One director paused halfway through typing an email. Another closed his laptop without saying a word. Something about the stranger's remarkable calm seemed oddly out of place. Most people confronted in front of an executive board either became defensive or embarrassed. He did neither. He simply looked at the name engraved on Victoria's identification badge before meeting her eyes again. "Thank you, Ms. Bennett," he said sincerely. "I will remember your kindness." The sentence lingered in the silence. It contained no sarcasm, no resentment, and no challenge. Yet it unsettled Victoria in a way she could not explain. Before anyone else could speak, footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. The conference room door opened once more, and every executive immediately stood as the chairman entered with several members of the board. Instead of walking toward the head of the table, the chairman crossed the room directly toward the unfamiliar man, smiling warmly as he extended his hand. "Marcus Brooks," he said, "thank you for waiting. We have all been looking forward to your arrival." Every conversation stopped. Every movement froze. Victoria slowly turned toward the man she had moments earlier assumed did not belong in the room, and for the first time that morning, certainty gave way to silence. The room remained perfectly still for several long seconds after the chairman welcomed Marcus Brooks with unmistakable warmth. No one reached for a laptop. No one whispered to the person beside them. Even the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system seemed louder than before. Victoria Bennett felt the confidence she had carried into the meeting begin to dissolve as she watched the chairman shake Marcus's hand with genuine respect. "Thank you for making time for us," the chairman said. "I know your schedule has been exceptionally demanding." Marcus smiled politely. "I appreciate the invitation. I am looking forward to our discussion." The chairman gestured toward the chair at the center of the conference table rather than the empty seat at the far end. "Please," he said, "this seat has been reserved for you." Marcus thanked him with a quiet nod before taking his place. Around the room, several board members greeted him by name, some with firm handshakes and others with warm smiles that reflected years of professional familiarity. Victoria remained standing for a brief moment, trying to understand what she had missed. She had reviewed every executive briefing, every agenda, and every confirmed attendee the previous evening. Now she realized one name had been intentionally omitted from every document she had seen. The chairman waited until everyone was seated before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Today marks the beginning of an important new chapter for this company. Before we discuss strategy, I would like everyone to meet the person who has spent the past year evaluating every aspect of our organization." He turned toward Marcus with visible confidence. "Mr. Brooks has advised some of the most respected companies in the country on organizational transformation, leadership development, and long-term growth. His recommendations have consistently strengthened both financial performance and company culture." A quiet murmur moved around the table. Several executives exchanged thoughtful looks, while others opened folders containing reports that had been distributed earlier that morning. Victoria slowly took her seat, her attention fixed on Marcus. The calm man she had assumed did not belong now carried the attention of every senior leader in the room without making the slightest effort to demand it. Marcus opened his leather portfolio and placed several neatly organized documents on the table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and remarkably composed. There was no sign that the uncomfortable exchange only minutes earlier had affected his focus. The chairman continued. "Over the past 12 months, Marcus has met with clients, employees, department managers, and industry experts. He has reviewed our performance from the perspective that matters most. Not only how we operate, but how people experience working with us." One board member leaned forward with genuine interest. "Your report has already generated considerable discussion," she said. Marcus acknowledged the comment with a grateful smile. "I appreciate that. Numbers help explain outcomes, but everyday interactions explain why those outcomes happen." The chairman nodded in agreement. "Exactly." Victoria lowered her eyes briefly toward her notebook, although she found herself unable to write anything. Every sentence reminded her of the brief conversation outside the meeting only minutes earlier. She replayed each word in her mind, searching for the moment she could have chosen curiosity instead of certainty. Marcus continued reviewing the documents before speaking again. "Organizations rarely succeed because of one extraordinary decision. They succeed because ordinary decisions are repeated consistently over time." The room listened carefully. His voice remained calm, steady, and thoughtful, never seeking attention yet naturally holding it. People form lasting impressions during the smallest moments. A greeting at the front desk, a conversation in a hallway, a first meeting with someone they have never met before. Those moments quietly shape trust long before contracts are signed. Victoria looked toward the conference room windows where the Manhattan skyline stretched beneath the bright morning sky. For the first time in many years, she questioned whether experience alone had made her a stronger leader or simply a more confident decision-maker. There was an important difference, and she was only beginning to understand it. As the chairman invited Marcus to begin presenting his recommendations, every executive leaned forward with focused attention, unaware that the most important lesson of the day had already begun before the meeting officially started. Marcus Brooks stood beside the large interactive display as the first presentation slide appeared against the conference room wall. The title was remarkably simple: Building Trust Before Building Profit. Several executives expected charts, financial projections, or market analysis. Instead, the screen displayed a single sentence: Every decision teaches people what your organization truly values. Marcus allowed the room a quiet moment to absorb the words before speaking. Most organizations believe culture is created through mission statements, he said calmly. In reality, culture is created through repeated behavior that employees watch every day. His voice remained steady, inviting reflection rather than demanding agreement. The chairman folded his hands with quiet satisfaction, already familiar with Marcus's approach. He knew the presentation would challenge assumptions without attacking anyone personally. Marcus advanced to the next slide, revealing a timeline of employee retention, customer satisfaction, internal promotion rates, and leadership evaluations collected over several years. The numbers showed steady financial success, but they also revealed a gradual decline in employee engagement and long-term retention. Your business is healthy, Marcus explained. Your people are working hard. Your clients continue investing with confidence. Yet beneath those successes, there are early signs that trust inside the organization is becoming inconsistent. One senior vice president leaned forward. What causes that? Marcus answered without hesitation. Rarely one major event. More often, thousands of ordinary moments. He looked around the conference table before continuing. People remember how leaders respond when situations are unexpected. They remember whether curiosity comes before judgment. They remember whether respect is offered before conclusions are formed. Victoria Bennett listened quietly, each sentence feeling unexpectedly personal despite the fact that Marcus had not mentioned her or their earlier interaction. She glanced toward the notebook resting unopened in front of her. For the first time in years, she realized she was listening not to defend her own perspective, but to understand someone else's. Marcus changed the slide again. A photograph of a hotel lobby appeared beside an image of a corporate reception area, followed by an airport terminal and a hospital entrance. Different industries, he said, but the same principle. The first interaction shapes every conversation that follows. Another executive asked, "Can one brief interaction really influence an entire business relationship?" Marcus smiled thoughtfully. More often than we realize. When people feel respected during the first minute, they become more willing to collaborate during the next hour. When they feel dismissed during the first minute, rebuilding trust can take months. Several board members nodded quietly. The chairman observed the expressions around the room with growing confidence. This was exactly why he had invited Marcus to guide the company's next stage of leadership development. Marcus walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan before continuing. Leadership is often mistaken for authority. Authority comes from a title. Leadership comes from influence. Influence begins with the way people experience you when there is nothing to gain. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of traffic many stories below. Victoria found herself remembering the confidence with which she had stopped Marcus outside the meeting. At the time she believed she was protecting standards. Now she recognized that genuine standards required something deeper than certainty. They required humility. Marcus returned to the table and closed the presentation remote in his hand. Today is not about identifying failures, he said. It is about identifying opportunities to become the organization people already believe you are capable of becoming. The chairman smiled warmly before addressing the room. That, he said, is precisely why we asked Marcus to help shape our future. Around the table, executives began exchanging thoughtful looks instead of immediate opinions. The atmosphere had changed. It no longer felt like an ordinary corporate strategy meeting. It felt like the beginning of an honest conversation about the kind of leaders they wanted to become, and although no one said it aloud, Victoria understood that the most important transformation in the room had already started within herself. The presentation concluded without applause, yet the silence that followed carried far more meaning than polite recognition ever could. Around the conference table, executives remained seated, studying the final slide long after the display faded to black. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath the late morning sun, while traffic flowed through the streets far below. Unaware that the future direction of one of the city's largest companies was quietly being reshaped several stories above. The chairman stood and slowly walked toward Marcus Brooks before extending his hand once again. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You have given us more than recommendations. You have given us perspective." Marcus accepted the handshake with his usual calm professionalism. Perspective only matters if it becomes action. The chairman smiled. That is exactly what I hope happens next. Before anyone could gather their notes, the chairman looked around the conference room. I would like everyone to remain for a few more minutes. Every executive settled back into their seats. Victoria Bennett felt a quiet uncertainty growing inside her. Throughout the presentation, she had recognized fragments of her own behavior reflected inside Marcus's observations, even though he had never once mentioned their encounter outside the meeting room. That choice impressed her more than any public criticism could have. He had protected her dignity while still challenging everyone to think differently. The chairman returned to the head of the table. There is one final announcement before we adjourn. He paused briefly, allowing every person in the room to focus their attention. Over the past year, the board has carefully evaluated the leadership needs of this organization. We unanimously agreed that our next chapter requires someone capable of strengthening both our business strategy and our culture. He turned toward Marcus. Today, I am pleased to officially announce Marcus Brooks as the incoming Chief Executive Officer of Hawthorne Global. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Several executives smiled before offering warm congratulations. Others immediately stood to shake Marcus's hand. Victoria remained seated, absorbing the announcement in complete silence. Only an hour earlier she had assumed Marcus was not supposed to be in the room. Now she understood that he would soon become the highest-ranking executive in the entire company, responsible for guiding every division, including her own. Yet the realization that unsettled her most was not his new title. It was remembering how graciously he had responded when she had misjudged him. Marcus thanked each board member with quiet humility before addressing the room. I am deeply honored by your confidence, he said. Titles create responsibility, not superiority. Every leader in this room brings experience that has helped this company reach its current success. My responsibility is not to replace that experience, but to help all of us build something even stronger together. His words immediately changed the atmosphere. Instead of sounding like a victory speech, they sounded like an invitation. One senior executive smiled. That may be the shortest acceptance speech I have ever heard. Light laughter spread gently across the room, easing the tension that had quietly followed everyone since the morning began. Victoria watched Marcus carefully. There was no trace of pride, revenge, or satisfaction at suddenly becoming the most powerful person in the room. His confidence came from purpose rather than position. As the meeting slowly came to an end, executives gathered their folders and exchanged conversations about upcoming projects, leadership initiatives, and organizational priorities. The chairman quietly approached Victoria before the others reached the door. "Would you remain for a moment?" he asked. She nodded immediately. Within minutes, only 3 people remained inside the conference room. The chairman, Marcus, Victoria. Warm sunlight continued reflecting across the polished walnut table while the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Victoria took a slow breath, fully aware that the conversation about to begin would not determine only the direction of her career. It would determine the kind of leader she chose to become from that day forward. Victoria Bennett remained standing beside the conference table long after the last executive had quietly left the room. The soft click of the closing door echoed through the spacious conference suite before silence settled over the floor once again. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued moving at its usual relentless pace, but inside the room, time seemed to slow. The chairman looked at Victoria with the calm expression of someone more interested in understanding than assigning blame. Marcus Brooks stood near the windows, his leather portfolio resting on the conference table exactly where he had placed it earlier that morning. He said nothing, allowing the silence to become an invitation rather than a punishment. Finally, Victoria took a slow breath. "Before either of you says anything," she began quietly, "I need to say something first." The chairman nodded. "Go ahead." She looked toward Marcus, meeting his eyes without hesitation for the first time since their encounter outside the meeting room. "This morning I made a decision before I had enough information to make one. I assumed I understood who you were instead of asking a simple question. Looking back now, I realize I was not protecting the standards of this company. I was protecting my own assumptions." Her voice remained steady, but every word carried genuine reflection rather than rehearsed regret. Marcus listened without interruption. Victoria continued. "The most difficult part is realizing how natural that decision felt at the time. I did not even recognize what I was doing until I heard you speak today. That concerns me far more than the mistake itself. The chairman folded his hands thoughtfully. Recognizing something honestly is often the beginning of changing it. Victoria nodded slowly. I hope so. Marcus finally stepped away from the windows and returned to the conference table. His expression remained calm and composed, exactly as it had throughout the entire day. May I ask you a question? He said gently. Victoria answered immediately. Of course. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the back of a chair. When you believed I was attending the wrong meeting, what made you so certain? Victoria considered the question carefully before answering. She understood there would be no benefit in offering excuses. Experience, she replied honestly. At least that is what I told myself. I believed I could recognize who belonged in certain situations based on patterns I had seen over the years. Instead of remaining curious, I became confident too quickly. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Confidence is valuable. It becomes dangerous only when it replaces curiosity. Those words settled quietly across the room. Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back toward him. You could have corrected me immediately. You could have embarrassed me in front of everyone outside. Marcus smiled gently. Would that have helped either of us? She slowly shook her head. No. Then there was no reason to do it. The chairman watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Neither person was trying to win the conversation. Both were trying to understand it. Marcus continued speaking in the same measured tone. Every leader eventually faces a moment that reveals something uncomfortable about themselves. The important question is not whether the moment happens. The important question is what they choose to become afterward. Victoria felt the weight of those words more deeply than any formal criticism could have accomplished. She remembered the years she had spent mentoring younger managers, encouraging them to admit mistakes quickly so they could learn from them. Somehow she had forgotten to extend the same standard to herself. I appreciate the opportunity to learn instead of simply being judged, she said sincerely. Marcus answered with a warm smile. Every person deserves that opportunity. The chairman looked from one to the other before speaking. This company has always invested in talented people. From today forward, I want us to become equally committed to developing wise leaders. Both Marcus and Victoria nodded in agreement. The conversation had moved far beyond one uncomfortable encounter. It had become the foundation for a different vision of leadership, one built on humility, respect, accountability, and the willingness to replace certainty with understanding whenever another person's story had not yet been fully heard. Late afternoon sunlight spread across the executive floor, turning the Manhattan skyline into a landscape of gold and silver beyond the towering glass walls. The conversation inside the conference room had ended nearly 30 minutes earlier, yet neither Marcus Brooks nor Victoria Bennett seemed eager to leave. The chairman quietly excused himself to answer a call, leaving the two of them alone in the spacious room where the day's most important lessons had unfolded. For a few moments, neither person spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, filled with quiet reflection instead of uncertainty. Victoria slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the city, resting one hand lightly against the cool glass. Thousands of people hurried along the streets below, each carrying responsibilities, ambitions, disappointments, and hopes that could never be understood from appearance alone. She realized how many decisions she had made throughout her career by relying on confidence instead of curiosity. The thought was difficult to accept, but strangely freeing at the same time. Marcus gathered the papers from the conference table with the same deliberate care he had shown throughout the day. He placed each document neatly inside his leather portfolio before looking toward Victoria. Leadership can feel lonely sometimes, he said quietly. She smiled faintly without turning away from the window. I always believed loneliness was simply part of the job. Marcus walked a few steps closer, stopping beside the long conference table. Sometimes it is, but isolation and certainty often arrive together. The higher people climb, the fewer questions they ask because they become accustomed to providing answers. Victoria considered the observation carefully. I think that happened to me. Marcus nodded gently. It happens more often than people realize. She turned toward him with an expression that carried honesty instead of defensiveness. This morning, when I stopped you outside the meeting room, you never argued. You never tried to prove me wrong. What? Marcus smiled thoughtfully before answering. Because proving someone wrong rarely changes their perspective. Giving them room to discover the truth themselves often does. The sentence settled quietly between them. Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. I spent years believing strong leaders always had to be certain. Marcus shook his head gently. Strong leaders know when certainty should pause long enough for another question. A quiet laugh escaped Victoria. I wish someone had told me that years ago. Perhaps someone did, Marcus replied warmly. Sometimes we only hear certain lessons when we are finally ready to receive them. The conference room door opened softly as the chairman returned carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. He placed one in front of each of them before taking his seat once again. I hope I am not interrupting anything important, he said with an easy smile. Marcus answered first. Only a conversation about learning. The chairman nodded approvingly. Then I arrived at the right moment. He looked toward Victoria. I have watched talented leaders throughout my career. The ones who lasted the longest were never those who claimed to know everything. They were the ones willing to continue learning after everyone else assumed they already had. Victoria wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup, allowing herself a quiet moment before speaking. I cannot change the decision I made this morning, but I can decide what kind of leader I become tomorrow. The chairman smiled. That is all any organization can ever ask of its people. Marcus looked toward the city one more time before closing his portfolio. Every company eventually writes its reputation one conversation at a time. Policies matter. Strategy matters. Financial discipline matters. But every one of those depends upon ordinary human interactions repeated consistently over many years. Neither the chairman nor Victoria disagreed. They had witnessed the truth of those words firsthand within a single day. Outside, the evening light continued settling across Manhattan while office buildings gradually illuminated one floor after another. Inside the conference room, no dramatic announcement remained. No confrontation waited to be resolved, and no victory needed celebrating. Instead, there was something quieter and ultimately more valuable. 3 leaders sat together understanding that genuine authority was never measured by the height of an office or the title printed beneath a name. It was measured by the willingness to see the humanity in another person before making any judgment about where that person belonged. And that realization marked the true beginning of everything the company hoped to become. Several weeks passed, and the changes Marcus Brooks introduced began appearing in ways no quarterly report could fully capture. The headquarters remained just as ambitious, the deadlines just as demanding, and the expectations just as high. Yet the atmosphere inside the building had become noticeably different. Employees who had once hurried past one another without speaking now paused to exchange greetings. Managers spent more time asking questions before offering conclusions. Meetings became shorter, but conversations became more meaningful. The culture Marcus had described during his first presentation was no longer an idea discussed inside conference rooms. It was slowly becoming the daily experience of everyone who walked through the front entrance. Victoria Bennett noticed the difference every morning. She had developed a new habit before beginning her own schedule. Instead of walking directly to the executive elevator, she spent several minutes in the lobby greeting employees arriving for work. She learned the names of receptionists she had previously known only by title. She thanked maintenance staff for preparing conference rooms before important meetings. She asked interns about their first week with genuine curiosity instead of polite routine. The changes were small, almost invisible when viewed individually, yet together they transformed the tone of the organization. One afternoon, Marcus invited the executive leadership team to attend a company-wide leadership workshop rather than a traditional strategy session. The event was held in the largest auditorium inside headquarters, where managers from every department gathered alongside supervisors, assistants, analysts, and newly hired employees. Instead of sitting on a stage above everyone else, Marcus placed his chair among the audience. Victoria immediately understood the message before a single word had been spoken. Leadership was no longer something displayed from a distance. It was something practiced beside other people. After welcoming everyone, Marcus stepped to the front of the room with the same quiet confidence that had defined every conversation since his arrival. Today, he began, I am not here to give a speech. I am here to listen. He invited employees to describe moments when someone inside the company had made them feel respected, encouraged, or supported during an ordinary workday. One by one, People stood to share simple stories. A supervisor who stayed late to help a new employee understand a difficult assignment. A receptionist who calmly assisted an anxious client during an unexpected delay. A project manager who accepted responsibility for a mistake instead of blaming the team. None of the stories involved extraordinary achievements. Every one of them reflected ordinary kindness practiced consistently. Victoria listened carefully as employees described experiences that reminded her of the lessons Marcus had been teaching since the day they first met. During a brief pause, Marcus looked toward the audience and smiled. Culture does not become stronger because leaders ask for respect. It becomes stronger because leaders demonstrate respect often enough that everyone else chooses to do the same. The room answered with quiet applause. Victoria slowly stood from her seat. Every face turned toward her, yet she no longer felt the need to defend herself or protect an image of perfection. "I would like to share something," she said honestly. The room became silent. "Several weeks ago, I made an assumption about someone before taking the time to understand who they were. That experience reminded me that confidence without curiosity can become a barrier instead of a strength. I am grateful that I was given the opportunity to learn rather than simply be judged." She looked toward Marcus with sincere appreciation before continuing. "The greatest lesson I have learned is that respect should never depend upon a title, a position, or a first impression. It should be the beginning of every conversation." The auditorium remained quiet for several moments before warm applause gradually filled the room. Marcus did not step forward to respond. He simply nodded with quiet encouragement, allowing Victoria's words to belong entirely to her. As employees returned to their departments later that afternoon, many carried more than meeting notes or training materials. They carried a clearer understanding of the kind of workplace they wanted to help build. Marcus watched them leave with a quiet sense of hope, knowing lasting change rarely happened through dramatic moments alone. It grew through countless ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who chose, day after day, to see one another with patience, humility, and respect before making any judgment at all. 6 months later, the headquarters of Hawthorne Global looked much the same from the outside, yet everyone who worked inside knew it had become a very different place. The polished marble lobby still reflected the morning sunlight. The elevators still carried employees to meetings filled with ambitious ideas, and the conference rooms remained busy from dawn until evening. What had changed could not be measured by architecture or reported on a balance sheet. It lived quietly inside the daily choices people made when greeting a colleague, welcoming a visitor, or listening before reaching a conclusion. The transformation had begun with one ordinary morning and continued through thousands of ordinary moments that followed. Marcus Brooks had settled naturally into his role as Chief Executive Officer. He remained approachable despite the responsibilities that now filled every hour of his schedule. He still walked through different departments each week instead of remaining behind the closed doors of the executive suite. He still greeted receptionists by name, thanked maintenance employees for their work, and paused to speak with interns who had only recently joined the company. His title had changed, but his character had not. Employees often remarked that the higher he rose, the more accessible he became. Victoria Bennett had also changed in ways that surprised even those who had known her for years. Her confidence remained, but it was now balanced by genuine curiosity. Before every important meeting, she made time to ask questions instead of assuming she already understood the answers. New employees often found themselves welcomed personally by her during their first week, and experienced managers noticed that she spent more time listening than speaking. One crisp autumn morning, the company welcomed a group of newly hired associates for orientation. Some arrived wearing expensive tailored suits. Others came in modest business attire after traveling from different parts of the country. Their backgrounds varied widely, but they all carried the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty that accompanies a new beginning. Victoria stood near the entrance of the training room, greeting each person with the same warm smile and the same respectful handshake. She never asked about titles before introductions. She never judged confidence by appearance. She simply welcomed every individual as someone whose story deserved to be heard. Marcus quietly observed from the back of the room without announcing his presence. He watched as one nervous young employee accidentally entered the wrong conference room before realizing the mistake. Instead of correcting him impatiently, Victoria smiled, walked over, and kindly showed him to the correct room while reassuring him that everyone feels uncertain on a first day. The young employee thanked her with visible relief before continuing down the hallway with renewed confidence. Marcus smiled to himself. Nothing about the moment appeared dramatic. There were no speeches, no applause, and no audience celebrating the exchange. Yet it represented exactly the kind of leadership he had hoped the organization would embrace. Later that afternoon, the chairman joined Marcus beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Together, they watched the city moving with its usual energy beneath the fading sunlight. "When we first invited you here," the chairman said quietly, "I believed we needed a better strategy." Marcus looked toward the streets below where countless strangers continued their own journeys. "And now?" he asked. The chairman smiled thoughtfully. "Now I understand that strategy follows culture more often than culture follows strategy." Marcus nodded. People build organizations one conversation at a time. The chairman extended his hand, and Marcus accepted it with the same quiet humility that had marked every important moment since they first met. Neither man needed to say anything more. The evidence surrounded them every day in the way employees treated one another, the trust that had grown across departments, and the confidence people now felt walking through the front entrance regardless of their position. As evening settled over Manhattan, office lights gradually illuminated one floor after another while employees headed home carrying laptops, notebooks, and plans for tomorrow. Somewhere among them were future executives, future mentors, future innovators, and future leaders whose potential could never be recognized through appearance alone. The revolving doors at the entrance continued opening for one unfamiliar face after another, each person bringing a story no one else could immediately see. Inside Hawthorne Global, those stories were no longer met with quick assumptions. They were welcomed with patience, respect, and the simple belief that every person deserved the opportunity to reveal who they truly were before anyone decided where they belonged.